In the waning days of the Second Age, when Gil-galad yet held dominion in Lindon, and the light of Erendil's star shone bright upon the western shores, there came tidings most dire to the halls of Ostin-Edil. Celebrimbor, master of the Gwaith y Myrdain, stood upon the highest tower of his city, gazing westward where the sun had set, behind clouds dark as morning shroud. "My lord," spoke Narvi the dwarf, chief among the craftsmen who had journeyed from Khazad-dûm to aid in the great works of Eregion. His voice carried the weight of stone and the echo of deep places. The scouts return from the gap of Rohan with words that freeze the blood in mortal vein. Celebrimbor turned, his gray eyes reflecting the starlight like pools of ancient wisdom. Upon his finger gleamed Vilya, mightiest of the three, though its radiance seemed dimmed by shadow. "Speak freely, friend of the mountain home. What evil stirs in the southern lands?" "Armies march from Mordor," Narvi replied, his weathered hands clutching a missive sealed with black wax. "Not the scattered bands of orcs we have long endured, but hosts beyond counting. And at their head," his voice faltered, "at their head rides one whose name we dare not speak," came a voice from the shadows. Galadriel emerged from the stairway, her golden hair seeming to hold the last light of day. Nenya, the ring of water, adorned her hand like captured starlight. "Sauron has revealed himself at last, no longer hidden behind the fair guise of Anatar." The name hung in the air like a curse upon the wind. For long had the elves of Eregion labored in friendship with one they had known as the Lord of Gifts, learning the secrets of ringcraft under his tutelage. Too late had they perceived the shadow that dwelt within that fair form. "How long before his host reaches the Mythethel?" Celebrimbor asked, though his heart already knew the answer. 3 days, perhaps 4, if the weather turns," Galadriel replied, "but that is not our gravest concern. He comes not merely with sword and flame, but with knowledge of our works, our defenses, our most sacred treasure." Celebrimbor's hand moved instinctively to his breast, where beneath robes of silver and blue lay hidden the remaining rings of power. The 9 had already been claimed, and the 7 were lost to dragonfire and the depths of the earth. Only the 3 remained free of Sauron's dominion, wrought in secret when Anatar's true nature had at last been glimpsed. "Then we must make our choice," he said, his voice steady as the foundations of the mountain. "Do we flee to Lindon with what we may carry, or do we stand and fight for the realm that has been our home these long years?" "There is a third path," spoke a new voice, deep and resonant as the roots of Fangorn. From the shadows stepped Elrond half-elven, herald of Gil-galad, his dark hair braided with silver threads, and his eyes holding the wisdom of both kindreds. "I bring word from the High King. Aid comes, but it will not arrive in time to prevent a siege." "What manner of aid?" Narvi inquired, hope kindling in his eyes like forge fire. "Gil-galad marches with the full host of Lindon, and Prince Isildur brings the faithful from Númenor, but they are yet many days distant. We must hold Ostin-Edil until their arrival, or all the works of Eregion shall be lost to darkness." Celebrimbor turned once more to the west, where the first stars were emerging in the darkening sky. "Then let us prepare for war. Send word to all the settlements of Eregion. Let every elf who can bear arms come to the defense of our realm. And you, friend Narvi, what word from your lord Durin?" The dwarf's face grew grave. "The doors of Khazad-dûm are sealed. My people fear that to emerge would be to meet the enemy in open field, where our strength would avail little against such numbers." But he hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. "But a few hundred of us who dwell above ground will stand with you. We have sworn the oath of stone and steel. It shall be remembered," Celebrimbor replied solemnly. "Now go, all of you. Make ready for siege. On the morrow, I shall speak words that may preserve hope, even should these halls fall to ruin." As his companions departed, Celebrimbor remained alone upon the tower, feeling the weight of ages upon his shoulders. The wind carried with it the scent of burning, and in the distance, red fires flickered upon the horizon like the eyes of hunting wolves. The long peace of Eregion was ending, and with it, an age of the world. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over Austin Edhill, as though the sun itself was loath to witness what was to come. From his tower, Celebrimbor watched as the last of the outlying settlements emptied, their folk streaming through the gates with what possessions they could carry. Farmers and craftsmen, lore masters and healers, all sought the protection of the city's high walls. "The outer defenses are prepared, my lord," reported Lindir, captain of the city guard. His usually pristine armor bore the stains of a sleepless night spent in preparation. "The bridges across the Saranen have been made ready for destruction, and the watchtowers are manned." Celebrimbor nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. In the deepest vaults beneath the city, he had spent the dark hours in labors more crucial than any defense of stone and steel. The three rings must be preserved, hidden beyond Sauron's reach, even should the city fall. And what of the people? Are the children and elderly secured in the lower halls? "Aye, my lord. The halls of making have been cleared, and provisions for a month's siege are stored below. Yet," Lindir paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Speak plainly. In such times, half-truths serve no purpose. There are whispers among the people. They say that Anatar walks with the enemy host, that he who dwelt among us as friend now comes as conqueror. The hearts of many are troubled." Before Celebrimbor could reply, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower, 3 long blasts followed by 2 short. The enemy was in sight. Racing to the parapet, the Lord of Eregion gazed out upon a sight that chilled his immortal heart. The host of Mordor spread across the plain like a dark tide, banners of black and red snapping in the morning wind. Orcs marched in ordered rank, their armor gleaming dully beneath storm clouds that gathered as if summoned. Trolls lumbered among them, and overhead, the shadows of fell beasts darkened the sky. At the head of this mighty host rode a figure in armor that caught and twisted the light, neither fully dark nor bright, but something between that hurt the eyes to look upon. Though distance veiled his features, all who beheld him knew that this was Sauron revealed at last, the deceiver made manifest. "So," Celebrimbor murmured, his hand tightening on Vilya, "the mask is finally cast aside." The enemy host drew near the outer defenses, and there came a sound like thunder, as 10,000 voices roared in unison. But louder still was another voice, one that had once spoken words of friendship within these very walls. It carried clearly across the distance, enhanced by power and malice. "Elves of Eregion," called Sauron, his words reaching every ear despite the span between them. "Too long have you hidden behind walls of stone, hoarding treasures that were wrought with my aid. I offer you this chance. Surrender what you have taken, and your lives shall be spared. Resist, and learn what fate awaits those who defy the Lord of the earth." From the walls came silence, broken only by the flutter of banners in the wind. Then Celebrimbor stepped forward, his voice ringing clear as silver bells across the plain. "Sauron Gorthor!" he cried, using the ancient name that meant the cruel. "Long did you deceive us with fair words and false friendship, but we are no longer blind to your nature. The treasures of Eregion shall never serve the shadow, whatever the cost to ourselves." A sound like grinding stone echoed from the enemy host, the laughter of the Dark Lord. "Then let your pride be your doom, kinsmen of Fëanor. Before this day's sun sets, your city shall burn, and your people shall rue the day they trusted to walls of mortal making." The assault began with volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. But these were not the crude shafts of orc-making. They flew with unnatural accuracy, guided by malice and sorcery. The defenders replied in kind, and the air between the armies filled with a deadly storm. "Hold fast!" cried Elrond, his own bow singing as arrow after arrow found its mark. "Remember Gondolin! Remember Gil-galad!" But even as the first attack was repelled, all could see that this was but the beginning. Siege towers rolled forward like moving fortresses, while beneath the earth came the sound of digging. The enemy sought to undermine the walls themselves. As night fell and the first day's assault ended, Celebrimbor gathered his captains in the hall of the fountain. By the light of the crystal lamp that had burned for an age, he saw weariness and fear in faces that had known only peace for centuries. "We have held for one day," he said simply, "but the enemy tests our strength, learning our weakness. Tomorrow will bring harder trials." "How long can we endure?" asked Galdor, keeper of the western gate. "Their numbers are beyond counting, and our arrows, however true, are not infinite." "We endure as long as we must," Elrond replied firmly. "Aid comes from Lindon, and every hour we hold is precious." But privately, as he stood again upon his tower in the watches of the night, Celebrimbor wondered if any aid could come swiftly enough. The fires of the enemy camp stretched to the horizon, and in their light, shapes moved that belonged to no wholesome part of creation. The siege of Ostin Edil had begun. 5 days had passed since the host of Mordor first appeared before the walls of Ostin Edil, and already the fair city bore the scars of war. Blackened stones marked where fire arrows had found their mark, and gaps showed in the battlements where the enemy's great catapults had done their work. Celebrimbor walked the walls in the gray dawn, stepping carefully over rubble and tending to the wounded. The faces of his people, once bright with the ageless beauty of the Eldar, now showed the strain of constant vigilance, yet none spoke of surrender. "The eastern wall grows weak," reported Glorfindel, who had arrived on the second day with a company of warriors from Rivendell. His golden hair was dulled with dust, and his armor bore fresh dents, yet his eyes still held the fire of one who had faced the Balrog of Morgoth. "Their miners work without ceasing. I fear they will achieve a breach before another day passes." "And the western gate?" Celebrimbor inquired, though he dreaded the answer. "Hold, but barely. The great ram they call Dumgorthad batters it without respite. Narvi has done what he can with iron bands and stone, but dwarfcraft cannot stand forever against such assault." From below came the sound of that accursed ram, a massive tree trunk capped with iron and carved with signs that hurt the eye to look upon. Each blow shook the entire city, and with each impact, more stone cracked and more hope dwindled. "My lord," came a breathless voice. A young elf warrior stumbled up the steps, his face pale with exhaustion. "The tunnels! We've found the tunnel!" Celebrimbor's blood ran cold. He had feared this moment since the siege began. "Where?" "Beneath the Hall of Fire. Narvi says they will break through before noon." There was no time for lengthy counsel. Celebrimbor gathered his captains with sharp words and swift commands. In the Hall of Fire, where once the great forge had burned in times of peace, Narvi knelt with his ear pressed to the stone floor. "Aye, there," the dwarf said grimly, pointing to a spot near the eastern wall. "They come like worms through the earth. 100 of them, perhaps more. When they break through..." His words were cut short by a grinding crack. The stones of the floor shifted, and through the gap came the sound of orc voices raised in triumph. "Back!" cried Celebrimbor, drawing Aeglos, the ancient blade that had tasted the blood of dragons in the wars of Beleriand. "Form ranks!" The floor erupted in a shower of stone and earth. Through the breach poured orcs like a black tide, their crude weapons gleaming in the lamplight. Behind them came the true terror, Uruks of greater size and strength, and at their head a figure in black mail that walked upright despite bearing the mark of the shadow. "I am Gothmords the Black, herald of Sauron the Great," the creature roared, his voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. "Surrender now, and your deaths shall be swift. In Elendel's name, never." Glorfindel's reply rang like a silver horn as he charged, his blade bursting into flame as it had in the days of old. The battle in the Hall of Fire was fierce and desperate. Elf swords met orc steel in a deadly dance, while overhead the lamps swayed and flickered from the violence below. Celebrimbor fought with the fury of his grandfather Feanor, his blade weaving patterns of death among the enemy ranks. Yet for every orc that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The breach widened with each passing moment, and the floor grew slick with blood, black orc blood that steamed and hissed where it touched the sacred stone. "The wall!" cried Lindir from his position near the great forge. "They've breached the outer wall!" Through the eastern windows came the sound of horns and battle cries. The enemy had achieved what they sought, a foothold within the city itself. Even as the defenders fought to seal the tunnel breach, orcs poured through the gap in the wall like water through a broken dam. "We cannot hold both breaches." Elrond called over the din of battle, his own blade red with orc blood. "We must fall back to the inner defenses." "Not yet!" Celebrimbor struck down an Uruk captain and turned to face Gothmors himself. "Not while hope remains." The herald of Sauron laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Hope, your precious Gil-galad, is yet days distant, and your walls crumble like sand before the tide. What hope can there be?" Steel rang upon steel as the two champions met in single combat. Gothmors wielded a great mace studded with iron spikes, each blow capable of crushing stone. But Celebrimbor was swift as the wind and keen as winter starlight, and his blade found gaps in the orc herald's armor. Yet even as they dueled, the situation grew ever more dire. The eastern quarter of the city was aflame, and orc voices echoed from the streets, where once had rung the songs of craftsmen at their work. "My lord!" Narvi's voice cut through the chaos. "The lower vaults. We must secure the lower vaults." The meaning was clear to all who heard. In the deepest chambers of Ostin-Edhil lay treasures beyond price, not merely gold and silver, but the accumulated wisdom of ages and secrets that must not fall into the enemy's hands. With a final mighty blow, Celebrimbor struck down Gothmors, the herald's body falling like a great tree. But even in victory, he knew the battle was lost. The city could not be held. "Sound the retreat," he commanded, his voice heavy with sorrow. "All forces fall back to the citadel. Save what can be saved." As the defenders withdrew through smoke and flame, the first breach had become a flood. Ostin-Edhil, jewel of Eregion, was falling at last. The citadel of Ostin-Edhil rose like a silver spear from the heart of the burning city, its walls built of the hardest stone and bound with spells of warding laid down in elder days. Here the defenders made their final stand, the remnant of a proud people gathered about their lord in the shadow of defeat. From the highest tower, Celebrimbor gazed down upon the ruin of his realm. Smoke rose from 100 fires, and through the streets prowled orcs and wolves, seeking victims among the ruins. The sight filled him with grief beyond words, yet also with a bitter resolve. "The vaults are sealed," reported Elrond, his face grim with ash and sorrow. "The ring lore and the great works are hidden where the enemy cannot easily find them, but at such cost." His voice trailed away. Below in the courtyard, the survivors huddled around fires, tending to their wounds and comforting their children. Of the 3,000 who had dwelt in Ostin-Edhil, fewer than 800 remained within the citadel's wall. The rest were dead, fled, or trapped somewhere in the burning ruin. "How long can we hold?" asked Galdor, his arm bound with blood-stained cloth. "Long enough," Celebrimbor replied, though his heart harbored doubts. "The walls are strong, and we have provisions for a week, perhaps more if rationed carefully." "And after that?" Lindir's question hung in the air like smoke. Before anyone could answer, a great voice boomed across the courtyard, enhanced by power until it seemed to come from the very stone. "Celebrimbor!" called Sauron from beyond the walls, "Lord of a ruined city and master of the dead. How long will you cling to pride when wisdom counsels surrender?" The defenders looked to their lord, and in their eyes he saw not fear, but determination. Whatever came, they would face it together. Celebrimbor strode to the parapet and looked down upon his enemy. Sauron stood before the gates in his true form at last, tall as the trees of Numenor, clad in armor that seemed wrought of shadow and flame. Upon his hand was the Master Ring, and its red light pulsed like a beating heart. "I offer terms, kinsman," Sauron continued, his voice now soft as silk but carrying to every ear. "Give me what I seek." The The 3 rings wrought in secret. The fruits of knowledge I myself taught, and I will spare your people. They may depart freely, to seek what refuge they may in the wide world. And if we refuse, Celebrimbor's voice rang clear and proud, then all will die, and your bodies will feed the crow. The choice is yours, but choose swiftly. My patience wears thin. A murmur ran through the defenders, and Celebrimbor knew that some few were tempted by the offer. Who could blame them? They had seen their city burn, and their friends die. The prospect of life, even in exile, held appeal for mortal hearts. But then Glorfindel stepped forward, his golden hair catching the light of the fires. "Remember, Gondolin," he cried. "Remember how fairly the enemy spoke before that city's walls, and how black was the reward of those who trusted his words." "Glorfindel speaks truth," Elrond added. "There is no bargaining with the shadow. To yield would be to serve him, willingly or not." Celebrimbor felt the weight of decision upon his shoulder. In his secret heart, he knew where the 3 rings lay hidden. Vilya with him, Narya, born by Gil-galad, far to the west, and Nenya in the keeping of Galadriel, who had departed ere the siege began. But would Sauron believe him if he claimed they were lost? "What is your answer?" Sauron called impatiently. "This." Celebrimbor drew Vilya from its hidden place and held it high so that its blue radiance shone like a star in the darkness. "By this ring and by the blood of my fathers, I defy you. Ost in Edhill may fall, but its spirit shall endure." The roar of fury that arose from the enemy's host shook the very foundations of the citadel. Sauron himself seemed to grow in stature, his shadow falling like a black veil across the courtyard. "So be it," the Dark Lord snarled. "If you will not yield what is mine by right, then I shall take it from your corpses." The final assault began at once. Great catapults hurled stones the size of houses, while overhead flew the Nazgul on their fell beasts, dropping fire and shadow upon the defenders. The walls shook under the impact, and cracks appeared in stones that had stood for centuries. But the defenders fought with the fury of the doomed. Every arrow found its mark. Every sword stroke told. Narvi and his dwarves had prepared surprises, hidden catapults that sent great stones crashing into the enemy ranks, and pots of forge fire that turned orc charges into funeral pyres. "The gates!" cried a voice from below. "They're at the gates!" Dum Gorthad, the great ram, had been brought forward once more. Each blow against the ancient gates of the citadel was like the beating of a titan's heart, and with each impact, the bronze hinges groaned in protest. "Ready the inner defenses," Celebrimbor commanded. "When the gates fall, and fall they will, make them pay for every step." As if in answer to his words, the great gates burst asunder with a crack like thunder. Through the breach poured the enemy like a dark tide, and behind them stalked shapes that brought madness and despair in their wake. Yet still the defenders fought on, step by bitter step, making their enemy pay in blood for every foot of ground. In the courtyard, they made their stand, backs to the great tower, weapons in hand and defiance in their hearts. And above them all, Vilya blazed like a blue star, its light holding back the darkness that sought to swallow the last remnant of free Eregion. As the battle raged in the courtyard of the citadel, with orc steel ringing against elf blade, and the screams of the dying echoing from the walls, a small group moved in secret through the deepest passages beneath Ost in Edhill. Led by Narvi and guided by the light of Vilya, they bore with them the greatest treasures of Eregion, not gold or jewels, but knowledge itself. "This way," whispered the dwarf, his voice barely audible above the thunder of battle overhead. "The passage runs deep, built in the days when we first came to trade with your people. Not even Sauron knows of it, for it was made by dwarfcraft and sealed with words of the Mountain Fathers." Behind him came Celebrimbor, his face drawn with pain from wounds taken in the courtyard fight, yet his spirit unbroken. In his hands he bore a casket of mithril, within which lay scrolls and tablets containing the accumulated wisdom of the Gwaith y Myrdain. Behind him followed a dozen of his most trusted companions, each bearing similar burden. "How far to the exit?" asked Lindir, glancing nervously at the low ceiling. The sounds of battle seemed to follow them through the stone itself. "Near a league," Narvi replied. "It opens in the foothills, where the woods grow thick. From there, we might yet reach Rivendell, though the way will be perilous." Celebrimbor paused, listening to the sounds from above. The clash of arms was drawing nearer. The defenders were being pushed back, step by step. Soon the enemy would break into the tower itself, and then, "My lord," Elrond's voice was gentle but urgent, "we must go. Every moment we delay is precious to those who yet fight above." "You speak truth," Celebrimbor agreed reluctantly. "Yet it grieves me to abandon them." "You abandon nothing," said Glorfindel firmly. "You preserve what matters most, the knowledge to rebuild, the hope to continue. Those who die above us do not die in vain, if their sacrifice saves this." They pressed on through passages carved from living rock, their footsteps echoing softly in the darkness. The way was narrow and treacherous, winding ever deeper beneath the roots of the mountain. Water dripped from the ceiling, and in places they had to crawl through gaps barely wide enough for a dwarf. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew fainter, replaced by something worse: silence. The kind of silence speaks of ending, of defeat, complete and final. "The citadel has fallen," Elrond said quietly, and all knew it to be true. They walked in silence for a time, each lost in private grief for friends who would never again see the light of stars. But grief was a luxury they could not long afford, for they were not yet safe. "Hold," Narvi whispered suddenly, raising his hand. "I hear something ahead." They paused, straining their ears in the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then, the soft scrape of claw on stone, and the sibilant whisper of voices speaking in the black speech. "Orcs!" breathed Lindir. "But how?" "Sauron is cunning," Celebrimbor replied grimly. "He would not leave escape routes unguarded. The question is, how many?" Narvi crept forward, silent as a shadow despite his heavy boots. When he returned, his face was grim. "A dozen, perhaps more. They guard the exit itself." "Can we find another way?" asked one of the younger elves. "There is no other way," the dwarf replied. "This passage was carved for secrecy, not convenient. We go forward, or not at all." Celebrimbor hefted the mithril casket, feeling its weight, not merely in his arms, but in his heart. Within it lay the future of his people's craft, the hope of ages yet to come. It must not fall into the enemy's hands. "Then we fight," he said simply, "but not as we fought above, in desperate defense. Here, in these narrow ways, we have advantages. Narvi, you know the ground. What do you counsel?" The dwarf's eyes gleamed in the blue light of Vilya. "The passage widens just before the exit. There is a natural chamber where water once pooled. If we could drive them back into that space." "A trap!" Glorfindel nodded approvingly. "Bottle them up where their numbers count for little." They made their plans swiftly, for time was not their ally. Even now, the enemy might be discovering the secret entrance, might be sending greater forces to seal their escape. The casket and the other treasures were given to the youngest and swiftest of their number, with orders to flee the moment the way was clear. "Remember," Celebrimbor said, as they prepared for battle in the deep places of the earth, "we fight not for glory or vengeance, but for the future itself. Let that knowledge give strength to your arm." The attack came swift and silent. Moving through the darkness like shadow, the elves fell upon the orc guards with blade and bow. In the narrow confines of the passage, the enemy's numbers meant little, and their crude weapons were no match for the keen steel of the Eldar. Yet orcs were not the only guardians Sauron had set. As the last of the black-clad warriors fell, there came a sound that chilled the blood. The scrape of many legs upon stone, the hiss of something vast and terrible stirring in the depth. "What is that?" whispered one of the younger elves, his face pale in the ring light. Narvi's face had gone ashen. "Something that should not be," he muttered. "The deep places have been disturbed, and old things wake that were better left sleeping." From the darkness ahead came a glow, not the wholesome light of star or flame, but a sickly phosphorescence that hurt the eyes to look upon. And in that light, shapes moved that belonged to the nightmares of the early world. The escape route was blocked, but there would be no turning back now. Whatever evil thing Sauron had awakened to guard this passage, they would have to face it or die in the attempt. The treasures of Eregion, and with them the hope of the future, hung in the balance. The phosphorescent glow grew stronger as they advanced through the passage, and with it came a smell that made their very souls recoil, the reek of things long dead, of corruption that had festered in darkness for countless years. The walls themselves seemed to weep with moisture that gleamed unnaturally in the sickly light. "By my beard," Narvi whispered, his voice tight with fear, "I know this stench." The old miners spoke of such things in the deepest shafts of Khazad-dûm, where even dwarves feared to delve. It is a watcher, one of the Uyarabain, the ancient horrors that dwelt in darkness before the sun and moon were made. Herder's Celebrimbor felt Vilya pulse upon his finger, its blue radiance seeming to recoil from the foul presence ahead. "Can we turn back?" "The way behind is sealed," Elrond reported grimly. "I hear orc voices echoing through the stone. They have found our trail." They stood trapped between hammer and anvil, with death waiting both ahead and behind. Yet still they pressed forward, for the alternative was to perish like rats in a trap, their precious burden lost to the darkness. The passage opened into a great natural cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow above. And there, coiled about a pool of black water, was the thing that had been set to guard their path. It might once have been some manner of sea creature, in the days when the world was young and the waters covered all the land, but eons of dwelling in the dark places had changed it into something wholly evil. Tentacles thick as ancient trees writhed in the poisonous water, while dozens of eyes like baleful stars glared at them from a body that defied description. "The Watcher in the water's kin," breathed Glorfindel, his hand tight upon his sword hilt. "But how comes such a creature to dwell beneath the mountains?" "Sauron's work," Celebrimbor replied through gritted teeth. "He has roused the ancient evils, made servants of things that should have remained buried in the depths of time." The creature stirred, sensing their presence. Its voice, when it spoke, was like the grinding of millstone, formed by no throat meant for speech. "Long have I waited in the dark places, long have I hungered, but now comes meat to fill the emptiness." One massive tentacle lashed out, quick as lightning despite its bulk. Glorfindel leaped aside, his blade flashing as it carved deep into the writhing flesh. Black ichor sprayed like acid, hissing where it struck the stone. "The water!" cried Narvi suddenly. "Do not let it drive you into the water. That is its domain. There we cannot hope to match it." The battle that followed was like nothing in the chronicles of war. The Watcher fought not with sword or spear, but with the writhing mass of its own corrupt flesh. Tentacles thick as tree trunks sought to crush and strangle, while smaller appendages darted out to grasp and tear. Yet the elves were swift as starlight and keen as winter wind. Their blades wove patterns of silver flame in the darkness, while Vilya's radiance drove back the shadows that sought to aid their foe. Elrond's sword Eglos found mark after mark, each blow sending the creature reeling in pain and fury. But for every tentacle severed, two more seemed to take its place, and the beast showed no sign of weakening. Worse still, the sounds of pursuit grew ever closer. The orcs had found their trail and would soon emerge into the cavern. "We cannot defeat it by blade alone," Celebrimbor called out, as a massive tentacle swept inches from his head. "It is too ancient, too strong." Then, perhaps, came a new voice from the entrance to the cavern. "You require different aid." They turned in amazement to see a figure robed in gray, leaning upon a staff that gleamed with white light. His beard was long and silver, and his eyes held depths like the sea itself. "Mithrandir!" cried Elrond in wonder. "But how come you here?" "I felt the stirring of ancient evil," the wizard replied, stepping into the cavern with measured pace. "And where such darkness wakes, there is work for one of my order." The Watcher hissed at the sight of Gandalf, its many eyes focusing upon him with malevolent intelligence. "Istari, I smell the light of the undying lands upon you, but you are far from your kindred, grey fool, and in these depths your power wanes." "Does it?" Gandalf raised his staff, and suddenly The cavern blazed with white fire that drove back every shadow. "I am Gandalf the Grey, servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass." The light struck the Watcher like a physical blow, and it recoiled with a shriek that seemed to shake the very mountains. Yet still it fought, driven by malice and ancient hunger. "The way!" cried Celebrimbor. "While it is distracted, the way is clear." One by one, the treasure-bearers slipped past the writhing mass of the creature, making for the passage that led to the outer air. But the Watcher, even in its pain, was cunning. A massive tentacle swept across the exit, barring their escape. "I will hold it," Gandalf declared, his staff blazing ever brighter. "Go! The knowledge you bear is worth 1,000 lives." "We will not leave you," Elrond protested. "You will, and you must." The wizard's voice brooked no argument. "This is not the hour of my passing. I have looked into the music, and my thread runs yet longer, but yours may be cut short if you delay." With aching hearts, they obeyed. Celebrimbor was the last to pass, pausing only to clasp the wizard's shoulder in farewell. "May the stars shine upon your path, Mithrandir, and upon yours, Lord of Eregion, until we meet again in the light." They emerged at last into the blessed darkness of night, breathing air untainted by corruption. Behind them, the mountains shook with fury of the battle below. But Gandalf's light continued to blaze, holding the ancient evil at bay. "The horses!" Narvi gasped, pointing to where a small group of mounts waited in a hidden grove. "I set them here before the siege began, against the hope that some might escape." They mounted swiftly, the caskets and scrolls secured with straps and cord. Behind them, Ostin Edhill burned like a funeral pyre, its light visible for leagues around. But ahead lay the path to Rivendell, and with it, the hope of preserving something from the ruin. As they rode through the night, Celebrimbor looked back once at the city that had been his life's work. Tears ran down his face, not of despair, but of something deeper. For though Ostin Edhill had fallen, its spirit lived on in the knowledge they bore, and the courage of those who had died to preserve it. The first phase of the war was ended, but the greater struggle lay ahead. 7 days of hard riding brought the survivors of Ostin Edhill to the borders of Rivendell, that hidden valley where Elrond had made his refuge in the shadow of the misty mountains. The horses were foam-flecked and weary, and the riders swayed in their saddles from exhaustion. Yet they pressed on through the morning mist that rose from the Bruinen. "Hold!" came a clear voice from the trees. "Who rides the hidden paths in such haste?" "Friends and kinfolk," Elrond replied, though his voice was hoarse from days of flight. "Survivors of Eregion's fall, bearing tidings that Gil-galad must hear." From the concealment of rock and tree stepped elf warriors in gray cloaks, their faces grave as they beheld the sorry state of the refugees. At their head was Erestor, Elrond's chief counselor, his usually serene features marked with concern. "My lord," he said, bowing deeply, "word came 3 days past of fire in the east, and refugees fleeing through the mountain, but we had not dared to hope." "Hope remains," Celebrimbor said wearily, dismounting from his spent horse, though dearly purchased. He gestured to the precious caskets they bore. "The ring lore is preserved, and the knowledge of the Gwaith y Myrdain lives yet." They were escorted swiftly to the house of Elrond, that fair dwelling built in the style of ancient Gondolin. There, in the Hall of Fire, where the flame burned eternal, they found sanctuary at last. Healers tended their wounds, while scribes prepared to receive their accounts of the siege and fall. "Tell me all," Elrond commanded, once they were refreshed, and their most urgent hurts attended. "Spare no detail, however dark. Gil-galad rides even now with the host of Lindon, but he must know what he faces." Celebrimbor spoke long into the night, recounting the treachery of Anatar, the siege of Ostin Edhill, and their narrow escape through the deep places of the earth. When he finished, silence hung heavy in the hall like a shroud. "So," Elrond said at last, "the mask is cast off entirely. Sauron reveals himself as he is, the enemy of all free people. But what of his purpose?" asked Erestor. "Surely the destruction of one city, however fair, was not his only goal. Celebrimbor's hand moved unconsciously to where Vilya lay hidden beneath his robes. He seeks the rings of power, particularly the 3 that were made in secret. With them in his possession, all other rings would be subject to his will. And where are they now? Though Aristor's voice was carefully neutral, the question hung in the air like a blade. Vilya, I bear with me, Celebrimbor admitted. Narya is with Gil-galad in Linden, and Nenya. He paused, suddenly realizing he knew not where Galadriel had gone when she departed Ost in Edhill before the siege. She rides to Lorien, Elrond supplied. Word came by swift messenger. She would rouse the Galadrim to war and prepare defenses in the Golden Wood. A messenger entered the hall, mud spattered from hard travel. "My lords!" he gasped, falling to one knee. "Tidings from Gil-galad the High King." "Speak," Elrond commanded. "The king's host has joined with Prince Isildur and the men of Númenor at the ford of Carrack. Together they march south. But Sauron has not waited idle. His armies spread like a plague across Eriador. The Shire is in flames, and the Tower Hills are besieged." The news struck like a physical blow. The Shire, that peaceful land where the hobbits tended their gardens and worried over nothing more dangerous than the weather, had become a battlefield. "How many does the enemy command?" Celebrimbor asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Countless beyond reckoning, my lord. Orcs out of Mordor, men from the east and south, and fell beasts that fly beneath dark wings. The very shadows fight for him now. And our own strength? 30,000 from Linden, as many again from Númenor, and whatever forces the other realms can muster. But against such numbers," the messenger's voice trailed away. Elrond rose and began to pace, his brow furrowed in thought. "There is more at work here than mere conquest," he said at length. "Sauron could have taken Eregion with a tithe of the force he brought. Why such overwhelming number? To ensure swift victory," Narvi suggested, "to crush all resistance before aid could arrive." "Perhaps," Elrond agreed, "or perhaps his goals are more ambitious still. What if he seeks not merely to conquer, but to end the resistance of the free peoples entirely? To break the will of those who would oppose him?" The thought sent a chill through all who heard it. For if Sauron could indeed crush all organized resistance, if he could scatter the armies of Gil-galad and lay waste to the great cities of the west, then who would stand against him? The age of the elves would end in darkness, and the dominion of men would never begin. "What counsel do you give?" Celebrimbor asked his kinsman. "You have ever been wise in matters of war and peace." Elrond was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames that danced in the great hearth. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of prophecy. "I counsel this, that we must look beyond this war to the war that will come after. For even if Gil-galad achieves victory, even if Sauron is driven back to his fastness in Mordor, he will not be defeated. The One Ring remains upon his hand, and while it endures, so does his power." "Then what hope is there?" asked Galdor despairingly. "The hope that lies in hidden things," Elrond replied cryptically. "In paths not yet taken, and choices not yet made. The music of creation is not yet ended, and its final notes are not for us to know." Before any could ask what he meant, another messenger burst into the hall, this one bearing the blue and silver of Gil-galad's household. "My lords," he cried, "the High King commands your immediate presence. The host of Linden is but 2 days' march distant, and there is great need of all who can bear arms." Celebrimbor felt his heart quicken. At last, the time for hiding was over. The final battle for the fate of Middle-earth was about to begin. The pavilion of Gil-galad, the High King, stood upon a hill overlooking the ford of Bruinen, its banners snapping in the wind that bore the scent of war from the east. Within its walls of silk and silver, the greatest lords of the West had gathered, for what all knew might be the final council of the free peoples. At the head of the great table sat Gil-galad himself, tall and stern as the kings of old, his gray eyes reflecting the weight of kingship. Upon his brow rested the crown of the Noldor, and at his side lay Eglos, the spear that had never known defeat. To his right sat Elendil the Tall, lord of the Dunedain, his sword Narsil gleaming in its sheath, while at his left was Isildur, his son, young but already proven in battle. Celebrimbor entered the pavilion with measured step, bearing openly now the blue radiance of Vilja. Beside him walked Elrond and Glorfindel, with Narvi representing the scattered folk of Durin's line. Other lords were there as well: Círdan from the Grey Haven, Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, and Gil-galad's own marshal. "Be seated, kinsman," Gil-galad said to Celebrimbor, gesturing to a chair at his right hand. "Your counsel is much needed in this dark hour." When all were assembled, the High King rose and spread upon the table a great map of Eriador, marked with tokens of black and silver to show the disposition of forces. "Behold our situation," he began without preamble. "Sauron's host has divided itself into 3 great armies. The largest, under his own command, moves west toward the ford of Carrack, seeking to bring us to battle. A second force, led by the Witch King of Angmar, marches north toward the Tower Hills, threatening the Grey Haven. The third, commanded by his lieutenant Khamul, the Shadow of the East, sweeps south toward the Gap of Rohan. His strategy is clear," observed Elendil, his deep voice carrying the authority of years spent in war. "He seeks to divide our forces, to prevent us from concentrating our strength. Yet we have advantages he may not expect," Gil-galad continued. "The Dunedain know every path and ford in this country, and the elves of Rivendell have prepared defenses he has not counted upon. More importantly, he believes the 3 rings are scattered and powerless." "Are they not?" asked Thranduil with careful neutrality. For answer, Gil-galad drew forth from beneath his robes a ring of gold set with a ruby that blazed like captured fire. "Narya I bear, the ring of fire, wrought by Celebrimbor in secret." At the same moment, Celebrimbor raised his hand so that Vilja's blue light shone forth, while from her place near the tent wall, Galadriel stepped forward, Nenya gleaming like starlight upon her finger. "By my beard!" breathed Narvi. "When did the lady arrive?" "This morning, with a company of her guard," Gil-galad replied. "She brings word from Lorien that gladdens the heart. The Galadhrim will fight, and Amdir of Lorien marches with 1,000 spears to join us. The 3 rings are mighty," Celebrimbor said gravely, "but they were not made for war. Their power lies in preservation, protection, healing, not in the dealing of death. Yet, together, they might achieve what armies cannot." Galadriel spoke for the first time, her voice like the music of hidden stream. "I have looked into the mirror of Lorien and seen visions that trouble the heart. The enemy's strength lies not merely in numbers, but in despair. He seeks to break the will of the free peoples, to make them believe that defeat is certain. And is it not?" Isildur's question was blunt, though asked without malice. "Our scouts report his host at near 100,000 strong. We can muster scarce half that number." "Numbers alone do not determine victory," Glorfindel replied firmly. "I fought at Gondolin when the odds were far worse, and even in defeat, we achieved more than seemed possible." "What do you counsel then?" Gil-galad asked, his gaze moving around the circle of faces. It was Elrond who answered, his voice steady and sure. "We must not fight, as Sauron expects us to fight. He anticipates a great battle, where his superior numbers will tell. Instead, we must divide our own forces, striking where he is weak, while avoiding his strength." "You speak of guerrilla warfare," Elendil mused. "The tactics of the desperate, the tactics of the wise," Elrond corrected. "Let Gil-galad take the greater part of our host and march openly toward the ford of Carrack, drawing Sauron's main force after him. Meanwhile, smaller forces strike at his supply lines and rear guard, force him to divide his attention, to wonder where the next blow will fall." "And the other armies?" asked Círdan. "What of the Witch King and his host?" "Leave them to me," Galadriel said quietly. "The power of Nenya is great in the defense of fair things. I can hold the Grey Havens if ships can be readied to evacuate the people should the worst befall." "Ships are prepared," Círdan confirmed. 3 great vessels lie at anchor, provisioned for a long journey. If need arises, we can take as many as possible across the sea." A heavy silence fell upon the council. All knew what that meant: the ending of the Elder Days, the departure of the elves from Middle-earth forever. "It need not come to that," Gil-galad said firmly. "We have allies still that Sauron has not counted upon. The dwarves of Erebor may yet join us, and word has gone to the eagles of the Misty Mountain. Even some among the Ents stir at last, roused by the burning of the forest." "What of the eagles?" asked Isildur. "Will they fight?" "Gwaihir has given his word," Elrond replied. "They remember the kindness shown to them in Elder Days, and they see that if Sauron triumph, no living thing will know peace." Celebrimbor stood and walked to the map, studying the dispositions with the eye of one who had spent long years in war during the First Age. "There is another possibility," he said at length. "Sauron's greatest strength may also be his greatest weakness. He bears the One Ring openly now, trusting in its power to cow all opposition. But the three rings were made to resist its dominion, if we could bring them close enough to the one." "What then?" Gil-galad leaned forward intently. "I know not for certain," Celebrimbor admitted, "but the rings call to each other across the void. There might be interference, disruption of his will and power. At the least, it would confuse him at a crucial moment. And at the most?" Galadriel's voice was soft, but penetrating. Celebrimbor met her gaze steadily. "At the most, we might learn the secret of unmaking what was made, but the cost?" He shook his head. "I will not speak of paths so dark." "Then it is decided," Gil-galad declared, rising to his feet. "We march at dawn, each to our appointed task. May the stars shine upon our endeavor, and may we prove worthy of those who came before us." As the council broke up and the lords departed to ready their forces, Celebrimbor lingered, staring at the map with troubled eyes. Beside him, Elrond waited in patient silence. "You think we shall fail," Elrond observed quietly. "I think," Celebrimbor replied slowly, "that victory and defeat may not be what we expect them to be." The music plays strange melodies in these latter days. Outside the pavilion, the hosts of the West made ready for what might be their final march, while in the east, the shadow of Mordor crept ever closer to the lands of light. Dawn came gray and cold over the ford of Carrock, where the waters of Anduin ran swift and shallow between banks lined with willows. The mist rose from the river like the breath of sleeping dragons, wreathing the vast encampments on either side in veils of silver and gray. On the western bank stood the host of the Free Peoples, 30,000 from Lindon, under the banners of Gil-galad, an equal number of Númenóreans led by Elendil and Isildur, and lesser companies from Rivendell, the Grey Havens, and the scattered settlements of Eriador. Their armor gleamed like stars in the morning light, and their banners streamed in the wind. The tree and stars of Gil-galad, the white tree of Númenor, and many others besides. Across the ford, stretching to the horizon like a blight upon the land, lay the host of Mordor. Orcs in their tens of thousands, Easterlings with curved swords and painted shield, Southrons with their Mumakil, and darker things still that shunned the growing light. Above them all flew the Black Breath, the Nazgûl upon their fell steeds, while in their midst stood the dark tower of Barad-dûr made portable, a great pavilion of black iron, from which the eye of Sauron gazed out upon his enemies. Gil-galad rode out before his host, Eglos in his hand, and Narya blazing upon his finger like a star of hope. Beside him rode Elendil, mighty in his strength, and behind them came the knights and captains of the West, their faces grim but unafraid. "Sauron!" Gil-galad's voice rang clear across the water, enhanced by the power of his ring until it reached every ear. "Lord of Mordor and master of lies, long have you hidden in shadow, working evil through servants and deception. Will you not face us openly at last?" The answer came not in words, but in a great roar that shook the very ground, the battle cry of 100,000 throats raised in malice and hate. The dark host surged forward like a black tide, while overhead the Nazgûl swept down with cries that turned courage to water in mortal veins. "Stand fast!" cried Elendil, Narsil flaming in his hand. "For Gil-galad and the glory of the West The armies met in the middle of the ford with a crash like thunder. Elf blade met orc steel, while the long spears of Numenor held back the charging wolves. The water ran red with blood, and the air filled with the songs of triumph and the screams of the dying. At the heart of the battle, Gil-galad and Elendil carved a path through the enemy ranks, their weapons blazing with light that drove back the darkness. Behind them came Isildur and Elrond, Glorfindel, and the other heroes of the West, each striking down foes beyond counting. But ever the dark host pressed forward, and for every orc that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Nazgul circled overhead like vultures, their very presence sapping the strength and will of the defenders, while the great Mumakil trampled through the ranks with towers of war upon their backs. "The ford is lost!" cried one of Gil-galad's captains, his voice barely audible above the din. "We must fall back." "Not yet," the High King replied, driving Aeglos through an orc chieftain's heart. "Hold the line. Help comes." Even as he spoke, horns sounded from the north, the clear notes of elf horns mixed with the deeper tones of dwarf horns blown in the deep places. Through the morning, mist came a sight to gladden any heart, the banners of Lorien and Mirkwood, and with them the axes of Durin's folk, who had broken their long isolation at last. Amdir of Lorien led the charge, his golden hair streaming behind him as he rode, while beside him came Orifer of the woodland realm, his warriors swift as deer through the morning shadows. From the eastern bank of Anduin poured a river of steel, 2,000 Galadrim, 1,000 wood elves, and 500 dwarves, led by Dain Ironfoot of the Iron Hill. The tide of battle turned in an instant. Caught between hammer and anvil, the enemy host wavered for the first time since the assault began. Orc captains shouted orders in the Black speech, trying to wheel their forces to meet this new threat. But the momentum of battle was no longer theirs. "Now!" cried Gil-galad, seeing his chance. "The 3 together! Let Sauron feel the power he has so long sought to claim." He raised Narya high, its ruby fire blazing like a star reborn. Across the battlefield, Celebrimbor answered, Vilya's sapphire radiance cutting through the gloom like a blade of hope. And from the northern hills came a third light, Nenya, borne by Galadriel as she rode with her guard to join the fray. The 3 lights met and merged, and suddenly the very air seemed to sing with power. The Nazgul shrieked and veered away, unable to bear the radiance, while the orcs below cowered and covered their eyes. Even the great Mumakil trumpeted in fear and began to mill about in confusion. But Sauron himself felt that light, and his fury shook the foundations of the world. The dark tower pavilion burst open like a blooming flower of shadow, and from within stepped the enemy himself, tall as a mountain, armored in black mail that seemed to drink light, and upon his hand the one ring blazing like a wound in the world. "Enough!" His voice was like the breaking of mountains, and where his gaze fell, brave hearts quailed. "Too long have I endured this defiance. Come then, Gil-galad the proud, and learn what fate awaits those who stand against their betters." The final phase of the battle had begun. While around them the armies clashed in desperate fury, the champions of light and shadow strode toward each other across a field soaked in blood and tears. In the distance, unnoticed by the combatants, a small figure in gray watched from a hilltop, leaning on a staff that gleamed with white light. Gandalf the Grey had arrived at last, though whether as observer or participant remained to be seen. The fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, and the next few moments would determine whether the light of the Elder Days would endure, or be snuffed out forever in shadow and despair upon the blood-soaked field of Carrick, while armies clashed around them like waves upon a storm-beaten shore. Gil-galad, the High King, and Sauron, the Dark Lord, faced each other as champions of light and shadow. The very air between them crackled with power, and lesser folk drew back in instinctive fear, for mortal eyes were not meant to witness such a meeting. Gil-galad stood tall and proud in his silver mail, the crown of the Noldor upon his brow, and Aeglos, the spear of kings, in his hand. About him played the light of Narya, the red ring, like flames of hope in the gathering darkness. Yet for all his majesty, he seemed but a candle before the inferno that was his enemy. Sauron towered above all other being, his form wreathed in shadow and malice. The one ring burned upon his finger like a star fallen into darkness, and where his feet touched the earth, the grass withered and died. His voice, when he spoke, was like the rumble of distant thunder. So, Gil-galad Eregion, last high king of a dying people, you would match your fading light against the flame that burns eternal? I, who was mighty when the world was young, who learned at the feet of Oli himself, what can you, child of a lesser age, hope to achieve? This, Gil-galad replied simply, and thrust with Eglos. The spear point blazed with silver fire as it drove toward Sauron's heart. But the Dark Lord turned it aside with contemptuous ease, his great mace Grond crushing down in return. Gil-galad leaped backward, the weapon passing so close that its wind stirred his hair, and the earth where he had stood cracked and split. Around them, the battle raged with undiminished fury. Elendil and Isildur fought back to back against a host of orc captains, while Elrond and Glorfindel carved a path through the enemy ranks toward the place where their king fought for all their lives. But none could aid him now. This was a battle that must be fought alone. You were ever proud, Gil-galad, Sauron snarled as they circled each other like wolves. Proud and blind to your own weakness. Where were your vaunted powers when Numenor fell? Where was your strength when my servants took the Nine? Learning wisdom, Gil-galad replied, and struck again with Eglos. This time the spear point found its mark, piercing the Dark Lord's shoulder and drawing forth Icarus blood that steamed upon the ground. Sauron roared in pain and fury, his form seeming to swell with rage. Enough of this mummery! The Dark Lord raised the One Ring high, and its light blazed forth like a malevolent star. Behold, the master of all rings, the maker of servants, the Lord of dominion. Before this power, what can your pitiful three avail? The ring's influence crashed over Gil-galad like a tide of despair and submission. He felt his will wavering, his strength ebbing, as the Master Ring sought to claim dominion over Narya, and through it, over him. But in that moment of greatest peril, two other lights blazed forth, Vilya and Nenya, born by Celebrimbor and Galadriel, as they forced their way through the battle to their king's aid. The three elven rings sang in harmony, their power intertwined in defiance of the One. Where their light touched, Sauron's influence faltered, and Gil-galad felt his strength return threefold. Impossible, Sauron snarled, real surprise coloring his voice for the first time. The three were wrought with my knowledge, guided by my wisdom. They should bow to the One as servants to their master. Your knowledge, yes, Celebrimbor called out as he struck down an orc warrior, but not your malice. In secret were they made, by arts you taught, but never mastered completely. They are free, as we choose to be free. The battle between the champions resumed with redoubled fury. Gil-galad fought with the strength of all the Eldar behind him, his spear weaving patterns of light that drove back even Sauron's mighty blows. But the Dark Lord was cunning as well as strong, and slowly, surely, he began to press his advantage. A mighty blow from Grond shattered Eglos near the point, leaving Gil-galad with only a broken shaft. Sauron's mace swept around in a crushing arc, and though the High King managed to interpose the remains of his weapon, the force of the blow hurled him to his knees. And so ends the line of Gil-galad, Sauron sneered, raising his weapon for the final blow. Die knowing that your people shall follow you into darkness eternal. But even as Grond descended, another figure interposed himself. Elendil the Tall, his great sword Narsil blazing with the light of the two trees. The blade met the mace with a sound like breaking worlds, and both weapons shattered, their fragments scattered across the bloody field. Elendil! Gil-galad struggled to his feet, drawing his sword. Together then, as it was always meant to be. Side by side, the last High King of the Elves and the greatest of the Dunedain faced their enemy. Sauron, though weaponless, was far from helpless. His hands burned with fire drawn from the ring's power, and his very touch could wither flesh from bone. What followed was beyond the skill of any bard to tell. 3 great lords of Middle-earth fought with weapons and will, with light and shadow, with hope and despair itself. The ground beneath them cracked and burned, and the air itself seemed to cry out in anguish. In the end, it was not skill or strength that decided the battle, but sacrifice. Gil-galad, seeing his chance, grasped Sauron's hand, the hand that bore the One Ring, though it burned his flesh like acid. Elendil, understanding, drove his broken sword deep into the Dark Lord's heart, though Sauron's dying blow shattered his skull and sent him tumbling into darkness. With a scream that shook the heavens, Sauron fell, his form dissolving into shadow and fire. The One Ring flew from his ruined hand, spinning through the air to land at the feet of Isildur, who had fought his way through the battle to reach his father's side. But Gil-galad did not see the ring's fall, for he too lay dying, his hands burned beyond healing and his life ebbing away with each labored breath. Elrond knelt beside him, tears streaming down his face, but healing could not undo such wound. The ring, Gil-galad whispered, his eyes finding Isildur, cast it into the fires. End this forever. Those were the last words of Gil-galad the High King, last of the great rulers of the elder days. With his passing, an age of the world ended, though few yet understood what had begun. In the sudden silence that followed Sauron's fall, the great armies stood frozen like figures in some ancient tapestry. Orcs and men alike stared in disbelief at the place where the Dark Lord had been, their minds struggling to comprehend that their immortal master could die. Steam rose from the blackened ground, where his form had dissolved, and the very air seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from the world. Isildur knelt beside his fallen father, his face twisted with grief and rage. Elendil the Tall lay still as stone, his noble features peaceful in death, the broken hilt of Narsil still clutched in his lifeless hand. Nearby, Gil-galad breathed his last, his burned hands finally releasing their grip on pain and duty alike. But between them, gleaming like a coal from some celestial fire, lay the One Ring. It was not as Isildur had imagined it would be. For all the terror of its reputation, for all the shadow it had cast across the world, it seemed almost ordinary, a simple band of gold, unmarked by any visible sign or rune. Yet, as he looked upon it, he felt a stirring in his heart, a whisper of power that promised dominion over all the world's hurts. "Take it up, Lord of Gondor," urged one of his captains, a man whose face was blackened with soot and blood. "It is the prize of victory, won by your father's sacrifice." "No," came a clear voice from behind them. Elrond approached through the thinning smoke, his face grave with exhaustion and sorrow. "Do not touch it, Isildur. Can you not feel the malice that clings to it still? It is not safe for any living hand to bear." "Yet bear it someone must," Isildur replied, his eyes never leaving the ring. "It cannot lie here forever, free for any servant of the enemy to claim." He reached out, slowly, as if drawn by some force beyond his will. "Wait," Celebrimbor said urgently, stepping forward despite the pain of his wounds. "I who helped forge the rings of power know their nature better than any. This ring, above all others, was made for domination, for the enslaving of will. Even Sauron's death may not have broken its hold entirely, but Isildur's hand was already closing around the golden band. As his fingers touched the metal, his eyes widened in wonder and fear. Through the ring flowed vision of armies marching at his command, of kingdoms bowing before his throne, of all the wrongs of the world set right by his will alone. "I feel it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and growing hunger. "The power to heal what is broken, to restore what was lost. With this, I could rebuild what my father dreamed of, a kingdom where justice reigns eternal." "Isildur, no!" Elrond reached out, but the son of Elendil stepped back, the ring now firmly upon his finger. "It is mine by right of conquest," Isildur declared, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a note of command that brooked no contradiction. "My father died for this victory, as did Gil-galad, the High King. I will not cast away the fruit of their sacrifice." Around them, the leaderless armies of Mordor began to stir. Without Sauron's will to guide them, many of the orcs were fleeing back toward the mountain, but others fought on, driven by ingrained hatred of the light. The battle was far from over, though its greatest prize had been claimed. "The armies scatter," observed Glorfindel, wiping his blade clean of orc blood. "Without their master's will to bind them, they revert to what they were, savage beasts, dangerous still, but no longer unified. Then let us finish what was begun," Isildur said, and his voice carried a new authority that made even the veteran warriors straighten response. "Hunt them down, every last one. Let none escape to carry word of this day to the fortresses of the east." Elrond watched the young king of Gondor with growing unease. Already the ring's influence was working upon him, subtle as poison in wine. The generous prince who had fought beside his father was hardening into something else, still noble in purpose, perhaps, but terrible in its certainty. "There will be time for that later," Elrond said carefully. "First we must see to our dead and decide what is to be done with that which you have claimed." "What is to be done?" Isildur turned the ring upon his finger, and its golden surface caught the light like a captured sun. "It shall serve the cause of justice, as it was always meant to do. The realms of men shall know peace under my rule, protected by power that no enemy can match. When you die," Celebrimbor's question was soft but pointed, "what then becomes of this terrible burden?" "I shall choose my heir wisely," Isildur replied with growing confidence. "The ring shall pass to one worthy to bear it, and through them to another, until all the world knows the blessing of righteous rule." But privately, even as he spoke these words, Isildur felt a cold certainty settling in his heart. The ring was his, and his alone. No other could be trusted with such power. No other could wield it with the wisdom and restraint it required. Perhaps, in time, when the world was perfected under his guidance, he might consider. But no, such thoughts were folly. The ring needed him, as he needed it. The great deception had begun. In the distance, unnoticed by the victorious armies, a small figure in gray robes watched from a hilltop. Gandalf the Grey saw what others could not, the shadow that already clung to Isildur like a second skin, the corruption that spread from the ring like ripples in a dark pool. "So it begins," he murmured to himself, his voice heavy with sorrow and prophecy. "The war is won, but the victory is hollow. Sauron is fallen, but his greatest work endures." He turned away from the battlefield, his staff tapping softly on the stone as he made his way down the far side of the hill. There were preparations to be made, watches to be set, for the darkness would return. It always did. Behind him, the armies of the West celebrated their triumph, unaware that they carried within their midst a seed of their own destruction. The One Ring had found a new master, and with it, a new path to dominion for all the world. The Second Age was ending in apparent victory, but the seeds of the Third Age's greatest trial had already been sown. 3 months had passed since the Battle of Carrick, and the armies of the West had returned to their respective realms, bearing news of victory and tales of valor. Yet in the halls of the great, there was little joy to be found, for the price of triumph had been grievous beyond measure. In Lindon, where the sea wind carried the scent of distant shores, Círdan the shipwright stood upon the grey quays and gazed westward toward the undying land. The ships he had prepared for the evacuation of the Eldar now served a different purpose. They bore the noble dead across the sundering seas to their final rest. Gil-galad was gone, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth. With his passing, an age had ended, and those who remained felt the weight of years settling upon them like snow upon autumn leaves. The crown of the Noldor now rested in the halls of Rivendell, unworn and perhaps never to be worn again. In that hidden valley, Elrond walked the paths of memory, tending to wounds both visible and hidden. The survivors of Ostinedel had found refuge there, but their city was ashes, and the great works of the Gwaith Myrdain were scattered to the winds. Of the 7 rings of the dwarf lords, most were lost or destroyed. Of the 9 given to men, all had fallen under the shadow's sway, along with their bearers. Only the 3 remained free, and even they carried a burden of sorrow. "You are troubled, my friend," said Celebrimbor, finding Elrond upon the high terrace, where the stars shone brightest. The Lord of Eregion bore his wounds with dignity, but the fire that had once burned in his eyes was dimmed by grief and regret. "As are we all," Elrond replied. "Tell me, in your wisdom of ringcraft, what do you see when you look upon the future?" Celebrimbor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "I see the slow fading of our people, the twilight of the Eldar in Middle-earth. The time of our dominion is passing, as it was always meant to pass. But I see also the rising of men, though their path will be neither straight nor easy." "And the ring? What of Sauron's masterwork?" "That is the shadow upon all our hopes," Celebrimbor admitted. "Isildur bears it now, believing himself its master. But none can master the One Ring save he who made it. It will corrupt him, as it corrupts all who claim it, and through that corruption it will work its will upon the world." "Then Sauron has won after all? Has he?" Celebrimbor turned from the stars to meet his kinsman's eyes. "His body is destroyed, his armies scattered, his fortresses cast down. It will be long years before his spirit can take shape again. Longer still before he can gather strength enough to threaten the free peoples. In that time, much may change. And yet, the ring endures." "Yes," Celebrimbor nodded sadly. "That is my greatest shame, that I helped create something that could never be destroyed by any craft of mine. But perhaps that was part of the music after all. Even Ilúvatar works through flawed instruments to achieve his will." From the courtyard below came the sound of footsteps, and they looked down to see a small company approaching the gates of Rivendell. At their head rode a figure they both recognized, Isildur himself, come at last to answer the summons Elrond had sent months ago. The King of Gondor had changed in the time since Carrick. He sat straighter in his saddle, and there was a light in his eyes that spoke of power long held. Upon his finger, the One Ring caught the starlight like a captured flame, and where that light touched, shadows seemed to deepen. "He comes," Elrond observed quietly, though whether as friend or foe remains to be seen. They descended to meet their guest in the Hall of Fire, where the flame burned eternal and the shadows held no terror. Isildur entered with measured step, his bearing regal, and his presence commanding. Yet for all his majesty, both elves could sense the darkness that clung to him. Not evil, perhaps, but something harder and colder than the generous prince they had once known. "Lord Elrond," Isildur inclined his head in greeting, the gesture perfectly courteous, yet somehow lacking in warmth. "Master Celebrimbor, I trust you have recovered from the trials of war?" "As well as may be expected," Elrond replied carefully. "And you, Isildur? How fares the realm of Gondor under your rule?" "It prospered," Isildur said simply, and there was pride in his voice, the pride of a man who had achieved great things. "The roads are safe, the borders secure, and justice flows like water to all who thirst for it. The ring serves its purpose well." "And what purpose is that?" Celebrimbor asked, his voice neutral as still water. Isildur's hand moved unconsciously to the golden band upon his finger. "Peace, order, the protection of the innocent, and the punishment of the wicked. Is that not what we fought for at Carrick? Is that not why good men died?" "Yea, it is," Elrond agreed. "Yet we wonder, is there not another way to achieve these ends? The ring bears a heavy burden of shadow. Might it not be better destroyed, its power ended forever?" The change in Isildur was immediate and terrible. His face hardened like stone, and his eyes blazed with a light that was cold as winter stars. "Destroyed?" His voice was soft, but it carried an undertone of menace that neither elf had heard from him before. Cast away the instrument of justice, the shield of the innocent? You speak like fool, blinded by ancient prejudice against things you do not understand. We understand better than you know, Celebrimbor replied steadily. I helped make the rings of power. I know their nature, their purpose, their danger. The One Ring was never meant to serve. It was meant to rule, to dominate, to corrupt all it touches. Then perhaps it has found the right hand to guide it, Isildur said, and there was finality in his voice. I did not come here to debate philosophy with relics of a dying age. I came because courtesy demanded it, to inform you that Gondor will have no more truck with Elven meddling in the affairs of men. He rose to leave, but Elrond's voice stopped him at the threshold. What of your sons, Isildur? What legacy will you leave them? For a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped, and they saw something of the old Isildur. Doubt, pain, and a love deeper than the sea. But then the ring pulsed upon his finger, and the hardness returned. They will inherit a world at peace, he said without turning around. That is legacy enough. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of winter wind and the echo of footsteps that rang like the closing of a tomb. So, Celebrimbor said into the silence, it begins. What begins? Elrond asked, though in his heart he already knew. The long defeat, the slow fading of all we have built and loved. The ring will work its will now, through Isildur and his heirs, and in the end, Celebrimbor smiled, though there was no joy in it. In the end, perhaps, redemption will come from the most unexpected quarter. The music is not yet finished, my friend, and its final notes may surprise us all. Outside, the wind rose among the trees, carrying with it the scent of change and the promise of sorrows yet to come. The War of the Ring was ended, but its true price was only beginning to be paid. And in the depths of shadow, in places where starlight never fell, something stirred. Not Sauron, for he was diminished beyond recovery, but his master work, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when it might at last come home. The Second Age was ending, and the Third Age would be born in shadow and flame. But that is a tale for another telling, in years yet to come.